I'm Andrew Raila Bammers, and this is Dead on Arrival.
In these videos, I discuss bad or unsuccessful locomotives and establish my thoughts on them, as well as why I leave them off extinct or favorites lists and never build them. The purpose of these videos are to inform and educate, and not to insult viewers. I better even read some comments. Oh, right. Well then.
When I made my top 10 Extinct British Steam Locomotives, I knew that I could potentially get several comments about not including the LBSCR E2s if I didn't explain why, or mention why. Seeing that this was the case with Jim Van Der Kolk's list, I briefly pointed out in that video that I would not be including classes that I didn't like because they were either sucked or were pretty unsuccessful. And among the three examples were the E2s, shown. So I know what you're thinking. Thomas the Tank Engine is based off the E2s. Why could a railroad enthusiast like me hate the E2s despite the fact that I grew up with Thomas the Tank Engine? Well, as it turns out that unlike Thomas, who was a very useful engine, the E2s were the polar opposite of that. Very useless and crappy locomotives. This is the truth behind the London, Brighton, and South Coast E2s. This could be potentially disturbing for any young kid. So, before we get into this review, if you have any young kids in the audience that have not outgrown Thomas the Tank Engine yet, or possibly might not be mature for what I'm just about to do, I strongly advise that you click away from this video, or have them get out of the audience, because this is not going to be pretty. With that final warning, let's get into this review.
By 1910, the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway needed a new class of 060 tank engines to replace their aging E1s built from 1874 to 1891. The current CME, Douglas Earl Marsh, attempted to rebuild them into a larger variant known as the E1X, but only one of them were rebuilt by the time he retired due to his declining health. Lawson Billington succeeded him as CME for the railway, and he decided to combat the E1's aging problems by building a brand new series of more modern 060s instead. The resulting locomotive was the E2, of which initially 5 were built in 1913, followed by 5 more with slightly larger water tanks from 1915 to 1916, totaling the number of E2s to 10, numbered 100 to 109. The design included several features found on other LBSCR locomotives, including an I2 boiler. The E2s were intended to be used for heavier shunting and short-distance freight trains in the London area on the south coast, but their coal bunkers were not big enough to carry enough coal for the entire journey. But not only were the bunkers too small, the E2s were found to be extremely inefficient with using water, and they consumed more of it at any rate of time than the average 060T. Or in other words, they were really, really heavy going on water. Or in other words, really, really thirsty. And knowing how dangerous it is for a steam locomotive to run out of water, it certainly does not help. In fact, the 5 later E2s had larger tanks because of this issue. The E2s were also slow and underpowered for an 060 tank engine of their size. Only 21,307 pounds for a 10-meter long locomotive.
This is crap!
Even smaller 060s with a smaller tractive effort of like 16,000 to 19,000 could shame that.
Oh, and the brakes were also horrible too. In fact, this became the inspiration for Thomas and the Trucks, which, in case you possibly don't remember, is the story where he gets pushed down Gordon's Hill by a bunch of trucks because he's not used to them. That's why.
In 1914, a pair of E2s were tried out on passenger trains and sometimes with the locomotives in the middle of a rake of 6 coaches, but they were horrible at it because they lacked the fuel efficiency and capacity to run on the frickin' route, and at anywhere above walking pace, the locomotive oscillated, which made for a rough ride for the passengers and crew, a similar issue that plagued the SDP-40Fs 6 decades later.
Do I even have to make fun of this? So, judging by these issues, you would not expect the E2s to last long, right? Well, wrong, because the E2s ended up lasting into the days of the LBSCR's successor, the Southern Railway. How is that possible? This was likely because of the havoc of World War I that delayed the E2's fate, because at that point, it was more condition over quality. In other words, it didn't really matter to the British if the locomotives were absolutely horrible locomotives, just as long as they were operable or functional. I mean, they were good with that. Not to mention that the LBSCR did judge them to be successful, apart from the water and brake issues, so how could they last much longer?
In the days of the Southern Railway, the E2s had 2,000 added to their road numbers and were used to replace locomotives that were unsuitable for specific jobs or more outdated than them, thus helping the E2s last a bit longer. After the Brighton line was electrified in 1936, the E2s were used at Herne Hill Marshalling Yard around Victoria Station as replacements for the former London Chapman-Dover Railway E-Class built from 1879 to 1893. Then during World War II, they also replaced the Southern Z-Class at Hither Green Marshalling Yard as the yard was too frickin' cramped for the Zs. At this point, time travelers can ask,
how are they not dead yet?
After nationalization in 1948, the E2s were still being used.
This is crap!
And had 30,000 added to their road numbers, as was the case with any other Southern locomotives. Granted, BR keeping these crappy tank engines in service is nowhere near as bad as the case with Montreal, Maine and Atlantic 5017, the faulty, poorly maintained unit involved in the Lac-Mégantic disaster. In the mid-1950s, the E2s did find decent work in dockyards, but their oversized wheelbase for an 060 16 feet made them unable to traverse some of the tight turns you'd find in dockyards, including those they ended up in. And they were also outclassed and shamed by the US Army S-100s imported to the UK during World War II, as the S-100s were, first of all, easier to maintain, had more cab space, and a shorter wheelbase of only 10 feet, so they could traverse tighter turns in these docks that the E2s
FRICKIN' couldn't!
Therefore, the S-100s could traverse the entire dockyard, and thus putting the E2s to frickin'
shame!
In fact, when Thomas was being modeled for the TV show, the designer decided to make him a squished version of the E2 with a shorter overall length and shorter wheelbase, therefore a shorter distance between the axles. Probably, or really, because of the E2's wheelbase issue. I mean, that's one way to mitigate some of the E2's problems.
The E2s were all retired from 1961 to 1963 following a replacement by diesel shunters, and with no surprise, every single one of them was almost immediately scrapped. The only reason anybody likes these things is because Thomas the Tank Engine is based on the E2s.
This is stupid! This is stupid!
This is the exact same thing as the DeLorean from the Back to the Future movies, a crap machine idolized by popular culture. The difference that Back to the Future wasn't aimed at motorists, while Thomas was aimed at railway enthusiasm, and thus an embarrassment, mainly because his real-life counterpart was, well, crap. Oh, and it was aimed at toddlers. That too.
And to make it worse, the E2s had become the faces of Thomas back in 1945, by Reginald Payne in Wilbur Awdry's Railway series or First Thomas books. Did they even know how horrible the E2s were? Or did they choose it because they wanted to see if they could make the E2s better locomotives with Thomas's design? Because if you think about it, even though they probably didn't or did know that Thomas would become a pop culture icon nearly 4 decades later, you should use a machine that was a good quality one for the basis of what could become a childhood or pop culture icon in the future. Because a bad quality one wouldn't work out that well for a really useful engine. The American equivalent of basing Thomas off of the E2s is literally modeling the Polar Express off of the ATSF 2 1010-2s, Pennsylvania S1Q Winter S2, Triplexes, or Fontaine to name a few, because they all sucked. If no kid would want this iconic Christmas train to be modeled after an awful locomotive, then they wouldn't want Thomas to be modeled after a bad locomotive class like the E2s, Leader, or A2/2. Think about it.
So to summarize the E2s, their flaws and disadvantages, including those over the S100s, were the result of them being too big for their own good, too big for an 060 that the wheelbase is too long, they consume too much water, their 6 wheels can't produce enough power for the locomotive size, and they're useless on passenger trains because they rode roughly and barely had enough fuel. At this point you could ask, why not rebuild them into 282Ts with a longer bunker, 2 larger outside cylinders instead of inside ones, and frames with a shorter distance between each axle? That's what I did for this Photoshop. That's a more acceptable wheelbase and wheel arrangement for this size, and surely that's going to generate enough tractive effort now. What else can I say to get your thoughts on the E2s turned in the direction of this video and others describe them as? Thomas should not have been based on this class in the first place. Feel free to check out this video in the upper right corner or description, or in the outro after watching this video, though, spoilers, it doesn't mention the E2's quality, nor that of their picks.
At this point, I don't even know what else to say. I hope your opinions of the E2s now match mine now, because that is the kind of E2 review you should expect to get from a train enthusiast. I'm the Nostalgia Critic, and I'm a member, so you don't have to. Wait, sorry about that. I got loads of carried away with cosplaying the Nostalgia Critic because it's Halloween. What I meant to say was, I'm Andrew Raila, and I hope you have a happy Halloween. Thanks for watching.